The lion then turned to the old woman. The cruel woman, watching from afar, felt a shiver of terror, imagining the end. But the beast saw no prey. It saw fragility. With surprising tenderness, the lion lowered its head and began to lick the old woman, gently, methodically, cleaning the raw meat from her wrinkled skin. It was as if it were caring for a lost cub, a gesture of instinctive protection that contrasted brutally with human malice. In that moment, under the sun of the luxury estate, the old woman found an unlikely guardian, a beast that embraced her where her own flesh and blood had abandoned her to the mercy of cruelty. The midday sun, once an accomplice in the planned scene of cruelty, now bathed a spectacle of surreal tenderness. The cruel woman, watching from afar what should have been her mother's macabre end, felt her blood run cold. It wasn't the terror of the old woman's death that paralyzed her, but the terror of her non-death, of the grotesque inversion of her machination. The majestic and imposing lion continued its work. Its rough, warm tongue moved over the mother's wrinkled skin, not with the voracity of a predator, but with the meticulousness of an artisan, removing every sliver of raw meat, every trace of the sadistic trap. It was a ritual of savage purification, a baptism of saliva and instinct. The old woman, previously on the verge of despair, felt the strange friction, the strong scent of the wild animal, the warm breath on her face, the guttural sound emanating from the beast's chest. All of it should have been the harbinger of the end. But it wasn't. There was a cadence, a brutal gentleness in those movements. The weight of the lion's paw, which moments before had crushed the pit bull with devastating force, now rested softly beside her fragile body like a protective anchor. She was being cleaned, cared for. Where her own daughter had stripped her bare and exposed her to death, the beast covered her with an invisible layer of protection. A tear rolled down the corner of the old woman's eye, not from fear, but from an overwhelming confusion, perhaps even a strange relief. It was the first time in years she had felt touched without malice, without intent to harm. The daughter, hidden behind a bougainvillea bush, felt her heart pound against her ribs. Her plan, so meticulously orchestrated to look like a tragic accident, crumbled before her eyes. The lion, king of the jungle, apex of the food chain, was acting like a mother cat. The image was so absurd, so outside of any logic, that her rational mind, accustomed to manipulating and controlling, failed to process it. What would she do now? The pit bull, her execution tool, lay inert, a shapeless mass of fur and bones. The lion, in turn, seemed to have adopted its prey. A low growl, almost a purr, escaped the lion's throat. Its amber eyes, previously focused on the old woman, shifted slightly. The cruel woman felt an even more intense chill. Had the beast perceived her? The distance was considerable, but a predator's keen senses were legendary. She cowered even further, her body tense, every muscle on alert. The luxury of the estate, with its impeccable gardens and shimmering pools, seemed a cruel irony. Civility had collapsed, replaced by the law of the jungle, and she, the human predator, was now the potential prey. The lion, satisfied with the cleaning, raised its head. Its eyes swept across the vast expanse of the lawn, pausing for an instant in the direction of the bush. The woman held her breath. There was no aggression in its gaze, but an unquestionable vigilance. It was protecting its cub. The old woman, now free from the smell of raw meat, was visibly calmer, though still in shock. The lion then did something even more unexpected. With a slow and deliberate movement, it lay down beside the old woman, its massive body forming a protective barrier between her and the outside world. Its head rested gently on its paws, eyes fixed on the horizon, like a sentinel. The daughter, observing the scene, felt a wave of icy panic. Her mother was not just alive, she was under the guard of one of the planet's most dangerous creatures. And the lion, with its imposing presence, blocked the only safe escape route to the house. She was trapped, exposed, and the predator that should have fulfilled her will now regarded her as a threat. The sun continued to shine, but the air seemed to have grown thick, heavy with the tension of the situation. What would happen when night fell? What would the lion do when real hunger struck? And, more importantly, what would she, the cruel daughter, do to escape the trap she herself had set? The silence of the luxury estate was broken only by the distant hum of insects and the frantic beating of her own heart. She was alone, at the mercy of the wild nature she had invoked. The sun, once a golden accomplice in the planned scene of cruelty, now began its slow descent, tinging the sky with orange and purple hues. Each passing minute was a drop of icy terror trickling down the cruel woman's spine. She was trapped. The lion, with its imposing mass, was a mountain of muscle and instinct blocking the only escape route to the safety of the house. The irony was a bitter poison in her mouth. She, the predator, had become the prey in her own sadistic game. Her heart beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a drum of panic echoing in the oppressive silence of the estate. The bougainvillea bush, which once offered a strategic hiding place, now seemed a trap, its sharp thorns a metaphor for her predicament. She couldn't move. Any sudden movement could attract the lion's attention, and the memory of the crushed pit bull was still fresh in her mind. That dog, so fierce and trained to attack, had been reduced to a shapeless stain in seconds. What would become of her, a fragile woman, against such a force of nature? The old woman, nestled beside the lion, seemed to have found a strange, safe harbor. Her eyes, once filled with terror, now held an expression of shock mixed with an almost serene resignation. The lion, in turn, kept its head raised, its amber eyes scanning the horizon, a vigilant sentinel. There was no hunger in its gaze, only an instinctive, almost paternal protection. It was as if the beast had taken responsibility for that fragile creature, a grotesque inversion of roles that defied all human logic. The cruel woman tried to rationalize. The lion was sated, perhaps. It had just killed the pit bull. But a predator's hunger was insatiable. A night was approaching, bringing with it the most primitive instincts. What would happen when darkness covered the estate? What would the lion do when the night's chill set in and real hunger struck? And more importantly, what would she, the daughter, do to escape the trap she herself had set? A chill ran through her body, not just from fear, but from humiliation. Her plan, so meticulously orchestrated to look like a tragic accident, had spectacularly unraveled. She had underestimated nature, the unpredictability of the wild. She had summoned a demon, and now she was trapped in her own personal hell. The smell of raw meat, which was once part of her sadistic plan, was now a constant reminder of her failure. The lion had cleaned her mother, but the odor still lingered in the air, an olfactory ghost haunting her. She cowered even further, trying to become invisible, wishing the ground would swallow her. The luxury of the estate, with its impeccable gardens and shimmering pools, seemed a cruel irony. Civility had collapsed, replaced by the law of the jungle, and she, the human predator, was now the potential prey. Shadows lengthened, transforming the familiar shapes of the garden into distorted and menacing figures. The birdsong ceased, replaced by the nocturnal hum of insects and the distant sounds of the forest. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves seemed a premonition of danger. The lion, with its keen hearing, seemed to register each of these sounds, its ears twitching slightly, its eyes fixed on the horizon. It was on alert, protecting its cub from any external threat, and the daughter knew that she was now the greatest threat. She tried to think of a strategy. Run? Impossible. The lion would reach her in seconds, scream for help. Who would hear her on that isolated estate? And even if someone did hear, who would dare face a lion? Her mind, accustomed to manipulating and controlling, was in a panic. There were no rules, no logic, only wild instinct. The old woman, for a brief moment, turned her head, and her eyes met those of her daughter, hidden in the bush. There was no accusation, no fear, only a strange mixture of confusion and a spark of something the cruel woman couldn't decipher. Was it relief? Peace. The idea that her mother could find peace in the arms of a wild beast after her own cruelty was a blow even deeper than the fear of death. The lion, as if sensing the exchange of glances, let out a low growl, almost a purr, but with a note of warning. Its amber eyes fixed on the bush for an instant, and the cruel woman felt her blood run cold. It had perceived her. It knew she was there, and it was warning her. Night fell completely, enveloping the estate in a shroud of darkness. Stars began to dot the sky, indifferent to the drama unfolding below. The cruel woman was alone, at the mercy of the wild nature she had invoked. The lion, an imposing silhouette against the night sky, continued its vigil, its massive body forming a protective barrier around the old woman. The silence of the luxury estate was broken only by the distant hum of insects and the frantic beating of her own heart. She was trapped, and the night promised to be long and terrifying. What would the lion do when real hunger struck? And more importantly, what would she, the cruel daughter, do to escape the trap she herself had set? Night swallowed the luxury estate with a silent voracity, transforming the immaculate lawn into a stage of dancing shadows and invisible terrors. The sun had completely surrendered, taking with it any remnant of hope for the cruel woman, now a prisoner in her own garden. The bougainvillea bush, once a mere hiding place, now seemed a shroud, its dark leaves and sharp thorns embracing her like a living trap. Every fiber of her being screamed for movement, for escape, but her body remained petrified, obeying the unwritten law of the jungle that had imposed itself. The lion, a massive silhouette against the star-dusted sky, was the personification of this law, a mountain of muscle and instinct blocking the only route to salvation. The night air brought with it the damp chill of the earth and the pungent smell of the forest, mixed with the metallic and unmistakable odor of blood, the blood of the pit bull, her tool of cruelty, now a grotesque reminder of her failure. The woman felt her heart pound against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that seemed to echo in the oppressive silence. Her eyes, wide and fixed on the imposing figure of the lion, tried to discern any movement, any sign of intent. But the beast remained motionless, a silent guardian, its amber eyes occasionally gleaming with the distant reflection of the house lights, like living embers in the darkness. The old woman nestled beside the predator seemed to have found a strange and disturbing peace. Her breathing was calm, almost regular, a shocking contrast to the panic consuming her daughter. The cruel woman couldn't understand. How could her mother, who should have been terrified, find solace in the arms of such a wild creature? The image was an affront to her distorted logic, a mirror reflecting not the expected fear, but a strange form of redemption for the victim and an even deeper condemnation for the tormentor. The inversion of roles was complete. The daughter, the predator, had become the prey, and the mother, the victim, was under the protection of nature itself. Time stretched, each second an eternity of agony. The woman's muscles ached, her legs were numb, her throat dry. Thirst was a secondary but relentless torture. She tried to think, to plan, but her mind, accustomed to manipulating and controlling, was in a panic. Running was suicide. Screaming was useless, perhaps even dangerous, attracting the beast's unwanted attention. She was trapped, not just physically, but in a nightmare of her own creation. The luxury of the estate, with its impeccable gardens and shimmering pools, was now a scene of horror, a gilded cage where civility had collapsed. The night's chill intensified, penetrating her light clothes and chilling her bones. She trembled, not just from fear, but from exhaustion and the cold. Shadows deepened, transforming every leaf, every branch into a potential threat. The nocturnal chirping of crickets and the hum of insects seemed amplified, each sound an alarm in her hyper-vigilant mind. She imagined the lion, with its keen hearing, registering each of these noises, its ears twitching slightly, its eyes fixed on the horizon, but always with a fraction of attention turned towards the bush where she was hiding. Hunger. The word echoed in her mind like a death knell. The lion had killed the pit bull, but a predator's hunger was insatiable. What would happen when real hunger struck? Would the old woman, fragile and defenseless, be next? Or would the lion, having perceived the closest threat, turn its attention to her, the daughter, the intruder in its new domain? The idea of being hunted, of being the prey, was a visceral terror that paralyzed her. She, who had always controlled, who had always manipulated, was now at the mercy of a force that could not be bought, bribed, or deceived. Hours dragged on. Darkness was almost total. Only the pale light of the stars and a distant crescent moon offered some visibility. The lion, a living statue of power and instinct, did not move, its vigil unwavering. The cruel woman, cowering in the bush, felt hope wane with each beat of her heart. She was trapped, and the night promised to be the longest and most terrifying of her life. What would the lion do when real hunger struck? And, more importantly, what would she, the cruel daughter, do to escape the trap she herself had set? Dawn seemed a distant mirage, an impossible dream to reach. Dawn seemed a distant mirage, an impossible dream to reach. Night, however, was not a static entity. It breathed, deepened, and with it the cruel woman's terror. The pre-dawn chill began to bite, an insidious ice that penetrated her thin clothes and settled in her bones. Her muscles, contracted for hours in the same position, protested with sharp aches and pangs. Her legs were numb, her feet felt like blocks of ice, and thirst scratched her throat, turning each breath into a painful effort. The smell of damp earth and dry leaves mingled with the persistent odor of blood, a vivid reminder of the violence she had orchestrated and that now imprisoned her. Her eyes, dry and burning, were fixed on the lion's silhouette. The beast, a mountain of muscle and instinct, seemed immune to the cold, its thick fur offering a natural barrier. It did not move, but its presence was an overwhelming weight, a gravitational force that pinned the woman to her hiding place. The amber eyes, once distant embers, now seemed to have adapted to the darkness, and the woman had the terrible feeling that they could see her perfectly, even through the dense foliage. Every snap of a branch under the weight of the wind, every rustle of leaves made her heart leap, convinced that the lion had perceived her slightest movement. The old woman, on the other hand, seemed to have merged with the nocturnal landscape, a fragile but inexplicably serene figure beside the predator. Her breathing was calm, almost inaudible, a shocking contrast to the panic suffocating her daughter. The cruel woman tried to decipher her mother's expression, but the darkness and distance made it impossible. Was it fear, resignation, or the most disturbing idea of all? Was it a strange form of peace? The image of her mother, whom she had dressed for death, now protected by a lion, was an affront to her reason, a grotesque distortion of her carefully constructed reality. Humiliation was a poison running through her veins as potent as fear. Her plan, so brilliant in its calculated cruelty, had unraveled into a spectacle of wild irony. Hours dragged on, each minute an eternity of torture. The woman's mind, once sharp and manipulative, was in a whirlwind of fragmented and desperate thoughts. Running was suicide, screaming was useless. Staying there was a slow death by cold, thirst, and dread. She tried to visualize escape routes, but the lion was the center of her universe, an insurmountable obstacle. The house, with its lights off and doors locked, now seemed an unattainable castle, its glass and concrete walls a barrier against the civility she had abandoned. A low growl, almost a murmur, escaped the lion's throat. It was not a sound of aggression, but of alert, of vigilance. Its amber eyes swept the darkness, pausing for an instant in the direction of the bush. The woman held her breath, her heart beating so hard it felt like it would tear through her chest. It knew, it had always known. That gaze was a silent promise, a warning that its patience had limits. The cold intensified, and the woman began to tremble uncontrollably. It wasn't just fear, but physical exhaustion, incipient hypothermia. Her teeth chattered, an irregular rhythm she tried to suppress, fearing the sound would betray her. She cowered even further, trying to become one with the bush, a dry leaf, invisible and insignificant. But the smell of sweat and fear, she knew, was a beacon for any predator. Hunger. The word echoed in her mind, cold and sharp. The lion had killed the pit bull, but a predator's hunger was insatiable. What would happen when real hunger struck? Would the old woman, fragile and defenseless, be next? Or would the lion, having perceived the closest threat, turn its attention to her, the daughter, the intruder in its new domain? The idea of being hunted, of being the prey, was a visceral terror that paralyzed her. She, who had always controlled, who had always manipulated, was now at the mercy of a force that could not be bought, bribed, or deceived. A subtle movement. The lion stretched one of its front paws, claws retracted and yawned, revealing a row of sharp, ivory-white teeth. It was not a yawn of tiredness, but of vigilant relaxation, of dominance. Then it shifted slightly, and the woman saw with a chill that ran down her spine that her mother nestled even closer to the beast, like a cub seeking warmth. The old woman, for a brief instant, turned her head, and her eyes, even in the dim light, met those of her daughter. There was no fear, no anger, only a strange and profound sadness, an acceptance that the cruel woman could not bear. It was as if her mother forgave her, or worse, as if she had abandoned her to her own fate. The woman felt a pang of anger mixed with fear. How could her mother prefer the company of a wild beast to hers? The irrationality of the situation drove her mad. She was the daughter, the heiress, the one who should be in control. But now, she was the intruder, the threat, the prey. The first pale lights of dawn began to tint the horizon a bluish gray. The night sky, once a velvet cloak, began to lighten, revealing the distorted shapes of trees and bushes. The birdsong, which had ceased with the darkness, began timidly, a hesitant chorus announcing the new day. But for the cruel woman, dawn brought no relief, only a new layer of terror. The light would reveal her hiding place. The light would bring visibility to the lion. The lion, an even more imposing silhouette against the brightening sky, raised its head. Its amber eyes, now more defined, swept the perimeter, and for a long, agonizing moment, they fixed directly on the bush where the woman was hiding. There was no more warning. There was recognition. There was a silent decision. The beast rose slowly, its powerful muscles stretching, and let out a low, deep growl that reverberated in the morning air. It was not a growl of hunger, but of possession, of dominance, and the cruel woman knew, with a cold and terrible certainty, that the night of waiting was over. The game had changed, and she, the predator, was now the prey, exposed to the light of day. What would the lion do now that darkness was dissipating? And more importantly, what would she, the cruel daughter, do to escape the trap she herself had set? Dawn, so longed for, was now the harbinger of her end. The morning air, previously just cold, now seemed to cut the cruel woman's skin like 1,000 invisible blades. The lion's growl, deep and resonant, was not an empty threat. It was a declaration, a sentence. The beast, in its wild majesty, did not rush. Every movement was deliberate, calculated, charged with unquestionable authority. It turned its head, its amber eyes fixed on the bush, and the woman felt completely naked, exposed despite the foliage. There was nowhere to hide. The growing light of dawn was her enemy, dissipating the shadows that protected her, revealing the farce of her hiding place. The lion took a slow step, one front paw followed by the other, its powerful muscles rippling under its golden fur. It was not a rush nor an attack. It was a march, an inexorable progression in her direction. The woman felt her heart pound against her ribs, a drum of panic that seemed to echo through the entire clearing. She tried to shrink even further, wishing she could merge with the earth, disappear. But her body was paralyzed, a statue of terror, incapable of any movement, any escape. The smell of blood, previously diffuse, now intensified with the morning breeze, mixing with the earthy odor and the wild scent of the lion itself. She could feel the predator's breath in her imagination, warm and damp, laden with the promise of annihilation. Her mind, once so astute and controlling, was in tatters, unable to formulate a plan, a strategy. Only the primal instinct of survival screamed within her, a mute and desperate cry. The old woman, beside the lion, remained motionless. Her eyes, previously fixed on her daughter, now seemed lost in some inner distance, a disturbing serenity that the cruel woman could not comprehend. The raw meat garment, which she had carefully prepared to attract death, now seemed a second skin for her mother, a bizarre armor connecting her to the beast. The lion, before taking another step towards the bush, tilted its head and gently licked the old woman's face, a gesture of affection and possession that made the daughter feel a shiver of revulsion and envy. It was as if the beast was sealing its dominion, cleansing any trace of her own cruelty. The sunlight, now stronger, began to filter through the treetops, painting the forest floor with golden patches. The idyllic morning scene contrasted brutally with the terror unfolding. The lion, bathed in light, seemed even grander, a king in its new kingdom. And she, the daughter, was the usurper, the intruder to be expelled. A sound, a rustle of leaves closer than she expected. The lion had moved again and was now a few meters from her hiding place. She could see the texture of its fur, the moist sheen of its nose, the cold intelligence in its eyes. There was no explicit anger, only a calm and lethal determination. It was not in a hurry. It was enjoying the game, the hunt. The cruel woman felt a knot in her throat. The words she wanted to scream, the pleas, the threats were stuck. Her voice, which had always been her sharpest weapon, was silenced by fear. She was the prey, and prey has no voice, only the instinct to flee, to fight, to die. But there was nowhere to run. The fence, which she thought was a barrier against the wild world, had become a trap. The house, once a luxury refuge, now seemed a distant mausoleum. Its doors and windows closed, sealed against the life she had tried to extinguish. The lion stopped. Its eyes narrowed, and it let out a low snort, a sound that vibrated in the air and in the woman's soul. It was there. Right there. She could feel the warmth of its presence, the weight of its attention. The beast lowered its head slightly, sniffing the air, and the woman knew that her scent, the scent of her fear, was an irresistible invitation. The old woman, in a slow and almost imperceptible movement, extended a trembling hand and touched the lion's mane. There was no fear in her gesture, only a strange familiarity. The lion did not react with aggression, but with a slight inclination of its head, as if accepting the touch. The scene was surreal, a grotesque painting of love and death, of innocence and cruelty. The mother, dressed to be devoured, was now the protected, the beloved of a wild beast, and the daughter, the architect of all the horror, was next in the line of fire. The cruel woman felt a tear roll down her face, not from remorse, but from pure despair. The lion, with its lethal patience, was waiting for her to move, waiting for her to reveal her fear. The game was over. The night of waiting had turned into a day of execution. What would the lion do now that darkness was dissipating? And more importantly, what would she, the cruel daughter, do to escape the trap she herself had set? Dawn, so longed for, was now the harbinger of her end, and the lion, with one last penetrating look at the bush, opened its mouth, not to growl, but to let out a low, guttural roar. A sound not of anger, but of triumph. A call, an invitation to the hunt. The lion's roar was not just a sound, it was a shockwave that tore through the morning air, vibrating in the cruel woman's chest, shaking every bone in her body. It was not a scream of uncontrolled rage, but a deep, resonant echo of dominance, an invitation to the hunt that chilled her blood. The promise of annihilation was palpable, an invisible weight crushing her against the damp earth. She cowered even further, eyes wide, fixed on the imposing silhouette slowly moving towards her. Each step of the lion was an eternity. Its paws, enormous and padded, barely made a sound on the foliage, but the impact of its presence was deafening. The woman could feel the ground tremble, or perhaps it was just the uncontrollable trembling of her own body. Her teeth chattered so loudly that she feared they might break. The predator's scent, a wild mix of earth, meat, and power, invaded her nostrils, suffocating her. She tried to hold her breath, to slow her heart rate, but it was useless. Fear was a beacon, and she knew the lion felt it, savored it. Her mind, once so sharp and calculating, was in tatters. There were no plans, no strategies, just a primordial panic that reduced her to an insignificant creature, on the verge of annihilation. Where was her intelligence now? Where were her manipulations, her threats, her lies? They were mere whispers in the face of a brutal and indifferent force. She was the predator, the controller, the architect of destinies, but now she was just flesh, a target, a prey. The lion stopped a few steps from the bush. Its amber eyes, previously distant, were now two incandescent orbs, fixed on her with a burning intensity. She could see every hair of its mane, every scar on its muzzle, the moisture in its nostrils as they twitched, sniffing the air, confirming her presence. The beast's hot, heavy breath seemed to envelop the bush, an invisible cloud of imminent death. The old woman, sitting serenely beside the lion, remained motionless, her eyes, previously lost, now fixed on her daughter with a disturbing clarity. There was no fear, no anger, only a profound and unfathomable sadness, an acceptance that the cruel woman could not decipher. It was as if her mother was observing a stranger, or perhaps a final chapter of a story she had already written in her mind. The raw meat garment, once a symbol of her cruelty, now seemed a second skin for her mother, a bizarre armor connecting her to the beast, making her part of that new and wild dominion. The cruel woman felt a pang of anger, a last gasp of her old personality. How could her mother be so calm? How could she accept the company of a beast her daughter had sent to kill her? It was a betrayal, an affront to her authority, even in the face of death. But the anger was quickly swallowed by terror. The lion tilted its head, and the woman felt an icy shiver. It was not in a hurry. It was savoring the moment, the game. With a slow and deliberate movement, it stretched one of its front paws, claws retracted and gently pushed the bush. The dry leaves snapped with a crack, revealing her even further. It was not an attack, but an invitation, a silent command to come out. She couldn't move. Her body was paralyzed, a knot of tense muscles and frozen bones. The words that should have come out, the screams, the pleas, were stuck in her throat. A lump of despair. She was the prey, and prey has no voice, only the instinct to flee, to fight, to die. But there was nowhere to run. The fence, the house, everything had disappeared, swallowed by the immensity of the forest and the overwhelming presence of the lion. The lion pushed the bush again, with a little more force this time. The foliage parted, and the cruel woman was exposed, naked and vulnerable to the pale light of dawn and the beast's penetrating gaze. She could feel the warmth of the lion's body, the scent of its mane, the slow, powerful breath emanating from its nostrils. She was inches from death. The old woman, in a gesture that seemed to defy all logic, extended her hand again and caressed the lion's mane, her thin, wrinkled fingers losing themselves in the golden strands. The lion, in response, let out a low snort, almost a purr, and tilted its head, as if accepting the affection. The scene was surreal, a grotesque painting of love and death, of innocence and cruelty. The mother, dressed to be devoured, was now the protected, the beloved of a wild beast. And the daughter, the architect of all the horror, was next in the line of fire. The cruel woman felt a tear roll down her face, not from remorse, but from pure despair. The lion, with its lethal patience, was waiting for her to move, waiting for her to reveal her fear. The game was over. The night of waiting had turned into a day of execution. What would the lion do now that darkness was dissipating? And, more importantly, what would she, the cruel daughter, do to escape the trap she herself had set? Dawn, so longed for, was now the harbinger of her end. The lion, with one last penetrating look at the bush, opened its mouth, not to growl, but to let out a low, guttural roar, a sound not of anger but of triumph, a call, an invitation to the hunt. And then it made a move, not to attack, but to position itself, blocking any escape route, its eyes fixed on hers, as if inviting her to a final and inevitable confrontation. The cruel woman knew there was nowhere left to run. The hunt had begun, and she was the prey. The lion, with a fluid and calculated movement, did not attack. Instead, it positioned itself. Its powerful muscles contracted and relaxed under its golden fur, not in a leap, but in a strategic reorientation. Now, it stood between the cruel woman and any trace of escape. The house, the gate, the fence, everything that represented the civilization and security she had perverted, was blocked by a wall of wild flesh and bone. Its eyes, previously merely penetrating, now burned with a cold intelligence, a comprehension of the situation that made her feel even more insignificant. It was not just an animal, it was a judge, an executioner. The cruel woman felt the air thin in her lungs. Each beat of her heart was a war drum, a deafening warning of her imminent end. She was completely exposed, the bush that protected her now just a tangle of broken branches and dry leaves. The light of dawn, which once seemed a promise of salvation, now bathed her in a brutal clarity, revealing her vulnerability, her pale skin, her eyes wide with terror. She tried to shrink, to become smaller, invisible, but it was useless. The lion had seen her, had marked her. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any roar. It was the silence of waiting, of inevitability. The surrounding forest began to awaken, small birds singing, insects buzzing, but these sounds were distant, muffled by the overwhelming presence of the predator. The lion's scent, a pungent mix of earth, animal sweat, and the metallic trace of meat, filled her nostrils, a constant reminder of her place in the food chain. She was the prey, and the smell of her fear was, without a doubt, an invitation. The old woman, sitting with a disturbing serenity beside the beast, watched her daughter. Her eyes, previously vague and distant, now carried a depth the cruel woman had never seen. There was no panic, no condemnation, only a quiet acceptance, almost a resignation. The raw meat garment, which the daughter had planned as an instrument of horror, now seemed a strange crown, a mantle that linked her to the wild majesty of the lion. It was as if, in the face of death, the mother had found a peace the daughter would never know. This image, the mother, the victim, now the protected of a beast, observing her with unfathomable calm, was a blow more cruel than any claw. the cruel woman felt a wave of nausea. It was not just the fear of death, but the humiliation, the complete inversion of her power. She, the architect of all the horror, was now at the mercy of her own machinations. Her mind, once so sharp and manipulative, was in collapse, unable to formulate any plan, any strategy. Only primal panic remained. The lion took a step forward, slow, deliberate. Every movement was a declaration of intent, a warning that playtime was over. Its padded paws barely made a sound, but the woman could feel the tremor in the ground, or perhaps it was just her own body trembling uncontrollably. She tried to scream, to beg, but her throat was dry, her voice trapped. The air felt dense, heavy, almost solid, preventing any sound from escaping. It stopped less than 2 meters from her, so close she could see the moist glint on its canine teeth. The small scars on its muzzle, the subtle movement of its nostrils as it sniffed the air. The beast's hot, heavy breath enveloped her, a scent of wildlife and imminent death. She could feel the heat radiating from its powerful body, the contained energy ready to explode. The lion lowered its head, not in submission, but in a gesture of evaluation. Its amber eyes narrowed, and a low sound, an almost inaudible growl, vibrated in its chest. It was not an attack roar, but a warning, a reminder of the power it possessed. The woman could feel the air vibrate with the beast's contained energy. She was inches from death, and every fiber of her being screamed for her to run, but her muscles were frozen, her body betrayed by terror. She tried to move a finger, a muscle, anything, but it was as if she were trapped in amber. The image of her mother, serene and almost maternal with the beast, was a distorted mirror of her own failure, her own cruelty. Her mother's raw meat garment, once a sadistic joke, now seemed a shroud for the daughter, a premonition of her own fate. The lion, with agonizing slowness, extended a front paw. Its claws, still retracted, were mere centimeters from her face. It did not touch her, only hovered there, a silent threat, a reminder of its capacity to destroy. It was savoring the moment, the inversion of roles, the wild justice it represented. The cruel woman closed her eyes, awaiting the impact, the end. But it didn't come. Only the warmth of its breath, the scent of its fur, the overwhelming presence of its existence. It was playing with her, like a cat with a mouse, and she was the mouse. The lion did not attack. There was no tearing of flesh, no snapping of bones, no sudden end that the cruel woman, in her deepest terror, almost wished for. Instead, the powerful paw, its claws still retracted, moved with terrifying precision, not to strike but to touch. The soft tip of its paw pad grazed the bare skin of her shoulder, a touch as light as a falling leaf, yet it made her tremble, as if struck by lightning. It was a touch of possession, a silent warning that she was under its absolute control. It didn't want to kill her quickly. It wanted her to know, to feel every second of her own annihilation. The beast's hot, damp breath, with its scent of wildlife and the metallic trace of blood, enveloped her, suffocating her. She tried to breathe, but her lungs seemed to have forgotten how. Her eyes, still closed, burned with the unshed tears of pure dread. She could feel the tremor in her own muscles, an uncontrollable spasm that made her sway slightly like a leaf in the wind. Humiliation was as palpable as fear. She, the manipulator, the architect of suffering, was now reduced to a toy, a puppet in the grip of wild and relentless justice. Her mother's voice, or the lack thereof, was a deafening echo in her mind. The old woman, sitting there, a few meters away, was the image of serenity. Her wrinkled fingers still caressed the lion's golden mane, and the animal, in response, let out a low purr, a sound that, in other circumstances, might have been mistaken for affection, But there in that grotesque setting, it was a sound of complicity, a silent pact between the victim and her protector against the predator. The raw meat garment, which should have been an invitation to her mother's death, was now a cloak of protection, a cruel irony the daughter could not bear. The cruel woman slowly opened her eyes, forcing herself to face her destiny. The lion was there, its amber eyes fixed on hers, an abyss of cold, ancient intelligence. There was no anger in its gaze, no fury. Only a calculating assessment, a patience that transcended time. It was not an animal acting on blind instinct. It was a judge, an executioner, and she was the condemned. It took another step, even slower, even more deliberate. The paw that had previously grazed her shoulder now moved to the ground, but not to retreat. Instead, the tip of a claw, still retracted but visible, touched the soil right beside her knee. It didn't scratch, didn't pierce, just marked. It was as if it were drawing an invisible circle around her, a boundary she wouldn't dare cross. She was surrounded, not by a physical fence, but by the overwhelming presence of the predator. The silence was broken only by the distant song of a bird, a sound that seemed mocking in its innocence. She could hear the frantic beating of her own heart, a war drum in her ears. Her mind, once so astute and full of Machiavellian plans, was now blank, paralyzed by terror. There was no escape, no bargaining, no excuse. The trap she had set for her mother had closed upon herself. The lion tilted its head slightly, as if listening to something she couldn't. Its eyes moved, not to the forest, but to the mother. And then something unexpected happened. The lion let out a soft snort, almost a murmur, and licked the old woman's face. Not an attack lick, but a cleaning, affectionate lick, as a lioness mother would do with her cub. The raw meat garment was licked along with the wrinkled skin, and the mother, in response, let out a soft sigh, a sound of pure contentment. This scene of wild and tender intimacy was the cruel woman's final torture. Her mother, whom she had tried to discard and humiliate, was being treated with a dignity and affection she had never shown. The inversion of roles was complete, brutal, inescapable. The daughter, who had clothed herself in power and control, was naked and powerless before the wildest truth. The lion, as if having finished its display of affection, turned its eyes back to the cruel woman. And then it made a move that made her hold her breath. It did not attack. Instead, it lay down, slowly, majestically. It settled on the ground, mere centimeters from her, its enormous, muscular body stretched out, completely blocking any escape route. Its head, heavy and imposing, rested on its front paws, and its amber eyes, still fixed on hers, seemed to glow with a profound understanding. It wasn't waiting for her to move to attack. It was waiting for her to move to not attack. It was waiting for her to understand the message. She was no longer the hunter, she was the prey, and it was the guardian. The game was no longer about death, but about waiting. Waiting for what? For full daylight? For others to arrive? Or perhaps just for her own mental disintegration? The cruel woman felt the cold ground beneath her naked body, the morning dew on her skin, but there was no freshness, only the icy sensation of terror. She was a cornered animal, but the predator was not interested in a quick kill. It was interested in a spectacle, in a lesson, and the audience was her mother, the waking forest, and the cruel woman herself, forced to witness her own end, not in an instant of pain, but in an eternity of dread. The lion closed its eyes for a moment, not in sleep, but in contemplation, and then opened them again, its gaze even more intense. It would not move, it would not attack her, not yet. It would keep her there, under its vigilant gaze, under the shadow of its overwhelming presence, until she broke. The hunt was over, but the execution, in a much crueler way, was just beginning. She was trapped, not by chains, but by fear. by the presence of a beast that had become her executioner and her judge. And the mother, the victim, now watched everything with a calm that was more terrifying than any roar. The rising sun, once a symbol of hope, now painted the sky with shades of bloody orange, reflecting in the lion's amber eyes. There was no warmth in its light, only a cold, merciless revelation of the grotesque scene. The cruel woman, naked and trembling, felt the icy morning dew on her skin, each drop a reminder of her vulnerability. She lay sprawled on the ground, her body curved in a position of forced submission, but her mind still struggled, a whirlwind of terror and humiliation. The lion lying a few meters away did not move. Its presence was a mountain of flesh and muscle, an insurmountable obstacle. Its eyes, previously closed in contemplation, were now open, fixed on her with an intensity that pierced her soul. It was not the gaze of a hungry predator, but of a judge who had already passed sentence, and now awaited its execution. The waiting was the punishment. The waiting was the torture. She tried to move her lips, perhaps to beg, to negotiate, but no sound came out. Her throat was dry, her facial muscles paralyzed. The image of her mother, serene and caressing the lion's mane, was a knife twisting in her chest. Her mother, whom she had planned to humiliate and eliminate, was now in a state of peace she would never know again. The raw meat garment, which should have been an invitation to death, was now a cloak of irony, a silent testament to the inversion of their destinies. The lion let out a deep sigh, a sound that made the ground vibrate. It was not a growl, but a sound of contentment, of satiety, as if her mere presence there, in her state of despair, was sustenance enough. It turned its head slightly, and the tip of its tail gently tapped the ground, a slow, deliberate rhythm that echoed the frantic beating of the woman's heart. Every fiber of her being screamed for escape, but to where? The forest, once a refuge, was now a labyrinth of shadows and threats. The fence, which should have kept danger away, was a cruel joke. She was trapped on her own stage of cruelty, and the audience was nature, her mother, and the lion. Her mind began to relive the moments of her life, not as memories but as accusations. The coldness with which she treated her mother, the cutting words, the meticulous plans to get rid of her. She saw herself, an impeccable figure in designer clothes, contrasting violently with her current nakedness and vulnerability. The irony was overwhelming. She had built a life of control, of power, only to be stripped of everything by a wild beast and an old woman she considered weak. The lion, as if it could read her thoughts, moved its head again, its eyes fixed on hers. There was something almost human in its gaze, an ancient intelligence that made her question if it was merely an animal. It was a guardian, an executioner, and perhaps a spirit of retribution. A bird landed on a nearby branch, singing a cheerful, carefree melody. The sound, instead of bringing solace, only accentuated the horror of the situation. Life went on, indifferent to her torment. She was a stain on the landscape, an error that nature was correcting. The mother, who had been motionless until then, made a small movement. Her wrinkled fingers, which had previously caressed the lion's mane, now extended and touched the beast's front paw. The lion, in response, let out a low, deep purr, a sound that reverberated in the air and in the daughter's soul. It was a sound of pure affection, of mutual trust. The mother looked at her daughter, and for the first time, there was something in the old woman's eyes that was not serenity. It was a glimpse of sadness, of pity, and perhaps of a silent understanding that the daughter had reaped what she sowed. The cruel woman felt a shiver run down her spine, not just from the cold, but from the realization. Her mother was not just being protected, she was participating. She had chosen the lion. She had chosen wild justice instead of the cruelty of her own flesh and blood. The lion, as if the scene of affection with the mother was an interlude, turned its attention back to the daughter. It opened its mouth slightly, exposing a row of sharp, white teeth, but did not growl. Only the beast's hot, heavy breath enveloped her again. It needed no verbal threats. Its presence was the threat. She closed her eyes again, wishing it were all a nightmare, that she would wake up in her luxurious bed, far from the dew, the raw meat, the smell of wild animal. But the smell persisted, the cold persisted, and the overwhelming presence of the lion was undeniable. The waiting continued. The sun climbed higher, warming the air, but not her body nor her soul. She was in a personal purgatory, a limbo between life and death, where torture was the absence of action, the uncertainty of what would come next. The lion would not kill her quickly. It would disintegrate her, piece by piece, starting with her mind. The hunt was over. The execution in its slowest and most agonizing form was just beginning, and the mother, the silent witness, was the living proof of her defeat. With each passing minute, reality became more vivid, more unbearable. The cruel woman felt the sand and earth beneath her fingernails, the roughness of the ground against her naked skin, the dampness seeping into her bones. She tried to focus on anything but the lion, anything but her mother's gaze, but it was useless. Every sound from the forest, the rustle of leaves, the hum of an insect, seemed amplified, transforming into a reminder of her insignificance and vulnerability. She was an intruder in the lion's realm, an aberration that needed to be corrected. Her body began to tremble uncontrollably, not just from the cold, but from a profound exhaustion that went beyond the physical. It was the exhaustion of a mind struggling to process the horror, to find logic where there was none, to escape a trap she herself had built. She thought of her lawyers, her security guards, her fortune. None of it mattered now. She was just flesh, vulnerable, exposed. The lion, as if sensing the imminent collapse of its prey, let out a slow, lazy yawn, exposing the depth of its throat, an abyss of power and death. The sound was soft, almost inaudible, but to her it was thunder echoing in her soul. It was not in a hurry. It was enjoying the spectacle, the slow disintegration of its victim. The mother, in turn, seemed to have fallen asleep, her head resting against the lion's warm flank, a faint smile on her wrinkled lips. The scene was as grotesque as it was tender, and the daughter couldn't tear her gaze away. It was the cruelest image of all. The mother, at peace, protected by the same beast that was torturing her. The cruel woman felt a tear roll down her face, mixing with the dew and dirt. It was not a tear of regret, but of pure despair, of a defeat so complete she could barely breathe. She had lost everything, her power, her dignity, her sanity. And worst of all, she had lost to the mother she so despised, and to a beast she would never have imagined existing in her world of luxury and control. The lion opened its eyes again, and an almost amused glint danced in its amber pupils. It would not attack her, not yet. It would keep her there under its vigilant gaze, under the shadow of its overwhelming presence, until she completely broke. The hunt was over, but the execution, in a much crueler way, was just beginning. She was trapped not by chains, but by fear, by the presence of a beast that had become her executioner and her judge. And the mother, the victim, now watched everything with a calm that was more terrifying than any roar. Her mother's calm, a serene mirror of her own defeat, was now the cruelest of punishments. Her eyes, once mere reflections of an existence the daughter considered insignificant, now shone with a depth the cruel woman had never perceived. There was no anger, no triumph, only a silent acceptance, a peace that transcended comprehension and which in some way was directed at her. It was the gaze of one witnessing an inevitable tragedy, without the power or desire to intervene. The daughter, naked and trembling, felt the weight of that gaze more than the morning cold or the lion's threat. It was a gaze that stripped her soul bare, Exposing every layer of cruelty and arrogance she had cultivated. She tried to look away, but it was impossible. The image of her mother, nestled beside the beast, her wrinkled hand still resting gently on the lion's paw, was etched into her retina. That touch, so tender and trusting, was a direct affront to everything she represented. She had planned her mother's death, a humiliating and solitary death, and now her mother was there, not just alive but protected, loved, in a wild sanctuary she could never touch. The irony was a slow poison, corroding her insides. The lion, as if sensing the intensification of the woman's mental torment, let out another sigh. Not a growl, not a threat, but a sound of deep satisfaction, almost a majestic yawn that revealed the immensity of its mouth and the strength of its teeth. It was a constant reminder of its power, a power it chose not to use, not yet. It was breaking her, not with claws and fangs, but with waiting, with humiliation, with the complete inversion of her world. The cruel woman's mind, once a labyrinth of strategies and manipulations, was now a chaotic battlefield. Images of her past life flickered like painful flashes. The coldness of her business dealings, the indifference with which she dismissed people, the veiled contempt for anyone she considered inferior. She saw herself in her luxury office, dictating orders, controlling destinies, and the contrast with her current nakedness and helplessness was a crushing blow. She, who had always been in command, was now the prey, the victim of a game she did not understand and could not win. A slight movement from the lion brought her back to reality. The beast moved its head, and its amber eyes fixed on her again. There was no hunger in them, but an ancient intelligence, a wisdom that seemed to read every thought of despair in her mind. It was as if the lion were the guardian of primal justice, an executor of karma she had accumulated over a lifetime of cruelty. It needed no words. Its presence was the sentence. The sun climbed, bathing the forest with a golden light that should have brought warmth and hope. But for her it was merely a merciless illumination of her disgrace. Every leaf, every flower, every insect buzzing in the air seemed to mock her situation. Nature, which she had ignored and exploited, now watched her with brutal indifference. She was a stain, an error the ecosystem was correcting. The mother, who seemed to have fallen asleep, slowly opened her eyes. There was no surprise or fear, only a profound stillness. She looked at her daughter, and then, with a slow and deliberate movement, extended her hand and touched the lion's mane again. The beast purred, a deep, vibrant sound that resonated in the old woman's chest. It was a sound of unconditional affection, of a bond the daughter could never comprehend or break. The cruel woman felt a sharp pang in her chest, a mix of envy and despair. Her mother, whom she had denied love and care, was receiving it from a wild beast. The raw meat garment, which should have been an invitation to death, was now a symbol of her own failure, a mantle of irony that covered her in shame. She tried to speak again, her throat dry and scratchy. A hoarse whisper escaped her lips. "Mother." But the word was lost in the air, without strength, without meaning. The mother merely watched her, her eyes conveying a deep sadness, a pity that was almost unbearable. It was not a pity of weakness, but of a painful understanding of consequences. The lion, as if the word mother had been a signal, raised its head. Its eyes moved from the daughter to the mother, and then, with calculated slowness, it stood up. Every muscle of its massive body contracted and relaxed, a spectacle of raw power. The cruel woman felt the ground vibrate beneath her, and her heart pounded. Was this the end, the final execution? But the lion did not approach her. Instead it turned, and with a graceful and powerful movement began to walk towards the broken fence, stopping only to look back one last time at the daughter. Their amber eyes met. And in that instant, the cruel woman understood. The lion would not kill her. It would leave her there, naked, broken, to face the consequences of her actions, to be consumed by her own despair. The hunt was over, but the execution, the cruelest of all, was just beginning, and she herself would be the executioner of her own mind. The mother, the victim, now watched everything with a calm that was more terrifying than any roar. And the lion, the judge, had passed its sentence. A life in her own purgatory, the lion, with a majesty that transcended human comprehension, took its last steps towards the broken fence. Every movement was a symphony of contained power, of muscles contracting and relaxing under its golden hide, a living reminder of the indomitable force she had challenged. It did not run, did not roar. It simply walked, with the calculated slowness of a judge who had already passed sentence. Its amber eyes, which moments before had fixed on her with a gaze of ancient intelligence, now averted, as if she no longer deserved its attention. It was the final contempt, the complete annulment of her existence. The cruel woman watched, paralyzed as the lion's imposing silhouette receded, swallowed by the dense vegetation of the neighboring forest. The sound of its heavy steps on the dry foliage was the last echo of its presence, a sound that mingled with the rustle of leaves and the hum of insects, and then silence. A silence that was not peace, but a deafening vacuum, more terrifying than any roar. She was alone. No, not entirely alone. The mother, still nestled on the ground, her head resting where the lion's warm flank had been, opened her eyes. There was no surprise, no fear, only that profound stillness the daughter now recognized as the cruelest of tortures. The old woman did not move, did not speak. Her eyes, once mere reflections of an existence the daughter considered insignificant, now shone with a depth the cruel woman had never perceived, a well of sadness and acceptance. It was the gaze of one witnessing an inevitable tragedy without the power or desire to intervene. A gaze that stripped her soul bare, exposing every layer of cruelty and arrogance she had cultivated. The sun climbed higher, bathing the forest with a golden light that should have brought warmth and hope. But for her, it was merely a merciless illumination of her disgrace. Every leaf, every flower, every insect buzzing in the air seemed to mock her situation. Nature, which she had ignored and exploited, now watched her with brutal indifference. She was a stain, an error the ecosystem was correcting. The raw meat garment, which should have been an invitation to her mother's death, was now a mantle of irony that covered her in shame. The smell of blood and viscera, once a macabre detail of her plan, now became nauseating, mixing with the cold sweat of her own terror. She felt the dryness in her throat, the roughness of the earth beneath her fingernails, the dampness seeping into her bones, the profound exhaustion that went beyond the physical, the exhaustion of a mind struggling to process the horror, to find logic where there was none, to escape a trap she herself had built. She tried to stand up, but her muscles were stiff, her body trembling uncontrollably. Every fiber of her being screamed for escape, for a refuge that did not exist. She was merely flesh, vulnerable, exposed. The image of her luxury office, of her business meetings, of her life of control and power flickered in her mind like painful flashes, a brutal contrast to her current nakedness and helplessness. She, who had always been in command, was now the prey, the victim of a game she did not understand and could not win. "Mother," she whispered again, her voice hoarse and broken, almost inaudible. The word was lost in the air, without strength, without meaning. The mother merely watched her, her eyes conveying a deep sadness, a pity that was almost unbearable. It was not a pity of weakness, but of a painful understanding of consequences. That gaze, previously merely passive, now seemed active, a serene mirror of her own defeat, the cruelest of punishments. Hours dragged on, transforming into an eternity of torment. The sun scorched. The cruel woman's skin began to burn, but she felt no heat, only the icy cold of despair. Thirst was a constant agony, her mouth dry and cracked. She tried to move, to crawl, but each movement was a monumental effort, and her mother's gaze, fixed on her, seemed to pin her limbs to the ground. The cruel woman's mind, once a labyrinth of strategies and manipulations, was now a chaotic battlefield. Images of her past life flickered like painful flashes, the coldness of her business dealings, the indifference with which she dismissed people, the veiled contempt for anyone she considered inferior. She saw herself in her luxury office, dictating orders, controlling destinies, and the contrast with her current nakedness and helplessness was a crushing blow. She began to talk to herself, incoherent whispers escaping her lips, mixing with the hum of insects. No, it can't be. I own all of this. Her voice was a pathetic lament, without conviction, without power. The luxury estate, once her kingdom, was now her tomb. The glass and concrete walls that once protected her from the outside world now seemed distant, unreal, as if they belonged to another life, another person. The mother, in turn, seemed to have entered a state of deep meditation. Her eyes were closed, a faint smile on her wrinkled lips. She felt no heat, no thirst, no putrid smell of the raw meat that still enveloped her. She was at peace, in a place her daughter could never reach. And this peace, this serene acceptance from her mother, was the final blow, the irrefutable proof of her defeat. The cruel woman had lost everything, her power, her dignity, her sanity, and worst of all, she had lost to the mother she so despised, and to a beast she would never have imagined existing in her world of luxury and control. The execution, in its slowest and most agonizing form, was just beginning, and she was the sole witness to her own hell. The hours stretched, not in minutes or seconds, but in slow, brutal hammer blows against the cruel woman's sanity. The sun, once a mere detail in her kingdom of glass and steel, now was a relentless executioner cooking her naked skin, transforming it into a parched and painful crust. Thirst was a razor scraping her throat, a fire consuming her insides, but she couldn't move. Every fiber of her body, once so controlled, so disciplined, now refused to obey, trapped in a stupor of shock and exhaustion. The smell. Ah, the smell. Her mother's raw meat garment, which should have been the catalyst for death, now exuded a putrid, sweet odor, mixing with the rancid sweat and the stench of damp earth. It was a constant, nauseating reminder of her failure, her cruelty, her helplessness. The wind, which once brought the aroma of exotic flowers from her meticulously planned garden, now carried the smell of decomposition, a grim omen that infiltrated her lungs, her mind. The mother, in turn, remained unperturbed. Her eyes, previously open in a profound stillness, were now softly closed, a faint smile playing on her wrinkled lips. She felt no heat, no thirst, no smell. She was in a distant place, an inner sanctuary that her daughter could never profane. The raw meat garment, which for the daughter was a symbol of shame and failure, for the mother was perhaps a cloak of protection, a memory of the beast's gentle touch, a link to a deeper truth that the daughter had denied her entire life. The cruel woman tried to scream, but her voice was a hoarse whisper, an inaudible lament that was lost in the incessant hum of insects. The flies, once invisible in her aseptic world, were now legions, landing on her skin, on her cracked lips, an army of tiny torturers reminding her of her vulnerability. She tried to swat them away, but her arms were heavy, inert, as if they no longer belonged to her. Her mind, once a fortress of logic and control, was now a chaotic battlefield. Fragmented images flickered in her vision, the cold gleam of her office, the sound of her own heels echoing in empty corridors, the faces of her employees bowed in submission. She saw herself in meetings, dictating orders, moving pieces on her chessboard of power, and the contrast with her current nakedness, her helplessness, her degradation was a crushing blow, a knife twisting in her soul. No, it can't be. I own all of this, she murmured, her words without conviction, without power. The luxury estate, once her impregnable kingdom, now seemed a nightmare setting. The glass and concrete walls distant, unreal, as if they belonged to another life, another person. The infinity pool, once a symbol of her dominion over nature, now reflected a merciless sky, a mirror of her own insignificance. With each passing moment, reality became more distorted. The shadows of the trees seemed to lengthen and contort, taking on menacing forms. The rustle of leaves sounded like mocking whispers, and the birdsong, once melodious, was now a shrill chorus of condemnation. Nature, which she had tried to tame and exploit, now watched her with brutal indifference, a silent witness to her downfall. She closed her eyes, seeking refuge in the darkness. But even there, the images of her past haunted her. Her mother's face, young and hopeful, then aged and resigned, now serene and at peace. The image of the pit bull, her instrument of cruelty, crushed under the lion's paw. And the lion, majestic and indifferent, licking her mother like a cub, an act of wild love she could never conceive. The sharp pang in her chest, a mix of envy and despair, intensified. Her mother, whom she had denied love and care, was there, not just alive, but protected, loved in a wild sanctuary she could never touch. And this peace, this serene acceptance from her mother, was the final blow, the irrefutable proof of her defeat. There was no more rage, only a profound sadness, a pity that was almost unbearable. But it was not her mother's pity for her. It was the pity she felt for herself, for all she had lost, for all she would never be. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky with orange and purple hues, but for the cruel woman, it was merely the prelude to an even longer and more terrifying night. The cold of night would begin to seep into her bones, and with it, the darkness that would bring not rest, but the intensification of her inner demons. She had lost everything, her power, her dignity, her sanity, and worst of all, she had lost to the mother she so despised, and to a beast she would never have imagined existing in her world of luxury and control. The execution, in its slowest and most agonizing form, continued. She was the sole witness to her own hell, a purgatory built by her own hands, where time was not a measure but a torture, and the only company was the echo of her own regrets under the serene and distant gaze of her mother, who had found her peace amidst the savagery the daughter so feared. And so, under the starry sky she had never truly seen, the cruel woman surrendered to her sentence, a life in a personal hell without end.